And then I'll give a few minutes for the panelists to speak with each other. And then if you can please, if you have any questions or comments, you would be welcome to put them in the chat. And I'm hoping we will close by 1:15 p.m. New York time at the latest. So each panelist will have about 8 to 10 minutes to share their experience with restorative justice. So Chief Butler, who's on this panel, he has told us about the Longmont Public Safety, and they use restorative principles and practices to address many of the crime, social, and health issues in their community. They use these principles and practices when responding to circumstances in which people are struggling with mental health, addiction, disorder-related issues, crime, and more. And Police Chief Butler, who's really a leader amongst police chiefs in the United States regarding restorative justice, he long ago disconnected the Longmont Public Safety from the criminal justice system as the police department started connecting more with their community. So he transformed the culture of his department so that police officers now prefer to divert individuals out of the traditional criminal justice system and into restorative practices. Also on this panel is Jeannie Lopez. She's the Bureau Chief, District Attorney's Kings County, and she works in the Red Hook Community Justice Center in Brooklyn. The winner of multiple national awards for innovation, the Red Hook Justice Center houses a courtroom in which a single judge hears cases that under ordinary circumstances would go to 3 different courts: civil, family, and criminal. And an independent evaluation found the Justice Center significantly reduced recidivism and the number of people receiving jail sentences while enhancing public confidence in government. Jeannie works with their innovative programs and is focused on healing and community restoration rather than punishment. She also has extensive trial and administrative experience. Also on the Zoom today, and we really have to thank Jill for helping us put this panel together. Jill Sternberg is the co-founder of Restorative Justice Westchester. And she's working with this new network to bring more restorative justice to Westchester. As a school-based restorative justice coordinator, Jill supports schools to become restorative places of learning that empower everyone in the educational community, from parents and students to principals and school resource officers. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you to the panelists. Jill, please tell us about restorative justice.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this webinar today. It's kind of a dream come true for me to really continue to promote restorative justice in our county and build a place where people can heal. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. We gather as guests on the traditional territory of the Wappinger Confederation and their relatives, the Lenape peoples. This is the ancestral area of the Munsee clans. They are the original stewards of this land who were removed unjustly. Let us pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future, and be mindful of broken covenants and the need to make right with all our relations. Let us be mindful of the ongoing impacts of colonization, loss of culture. Recent data from the Vera Institute says that states that 90.6% of the people in Westchester currently serving sentences in New York State are people of color. They are 42% of our population. 14% of our youth are Black, yet 60% of those detained are Black. And that's why I'm doing this work. Restorative justice is an approach to wrongdoing that brings together those most affected to acknowledge the harm done, consider how best to address that harm, and prevent similar harm in the future. It's about taking responsibility, accountability, and healing. Restorative justice is about restoring relationships. It represents a completely different paradigm of justice, but not a new one. Restorative justice, or RJ, traces its origins back to community-based conflict resolution practices found in many indigenous cultures. The term was coined in the late 1970s to refer to efforts at victim offender mediation and other restorative practices. Popularly, there's no one notion of what restorative justice is. It has various nuances. And I personally think this is a good thing. I think the most important part of restorative justice is addressing harm holistically. And this needs to be done without causing additional shame and taking into account historical harms, not causing more harm. Restorative justice is a relational approach to justice. It aims to restore human relationships, dignity, respect, and empathy. It promotes a justice system that restores dignity and fosters meaningful accountability. Our adversarial justice system assumes that the optimal outcome from one party is incompatible with the optimal outcome for the other. In the adversarial system, there is inevitably a winner and a loser. Retributive justice asks what law or rule was broken, who is responsible, and what punishment do they deserve. Restorative justice asks who was harmed, what are the needs and the responsibilities of those involved, and how can all affected parties make things as right as possible. The retributive system focuses on a specific incident where a rule was broken. Restorative justice allows space for the context to be considered. This can build empathy and understanding between the parties and lead to more individualized solutions that can address the real needs of all parties involved. As Nada said, most of my work is in schools, and I just wanted to share an example from schools. And this is an example where some students got in a fight in an advisory class. Afterwards, after the emotions had settled, and we began discussing how to repair that harm that they caused, they acknowledged that the fight was over something stupid, and it was really a stupid thing to do. They agreed to apologize and create a restorative circle that acknowledged the futility and the impact of fighting in school. This allowed them to avoid suspension, missing class, and to do the hard work of taking responsibility for what they did. Accountability in restorative justice is active and multi-stepped. One must acknowledge the harm caused, accept responsibility for causing that harm, take steps to make things as right as possible, but it does decrease the likelihood that there will be a recidivism. Examples of restorative justice include peacemaking or conflict circles, sentencing circles, harm circles, community building circles, conferences, such as family conference or community conferencing, and victim offender dialogue or mediation. There are different practices and traditions, and you'll hear about some today. A commonality in all of the process is to explore what happened, what the person was thinking and feeling at the time, both the people who caused harm and those who were harmed, what they have thought about since the incident, and who was impacted and how. Our jury system is designed to give community voice into legal matters. However, most criminal cases are resolved through plea bargaining. And so the people directly impacted and the broader community have very little input. Restorative justice gives the community role in addressing the impact of the crime. Think of the example I just shared from school. The whole advisory class participated in a restorative circle and had an opportunity to talk about how fighting had impacted, how that fight and how fighting in school impacts them. Restorative justice provides a stronger pathway for authentically building healthy relationships between community and law enforcement agencies. All 50 states have statutes on restorative justice. There are over 300 statutes, and these vary widely. They are primarily unstructured, without funding or administrative support or structure. They are not mandated. Typically, they are discretional, and this is problematic because discretionary policies have low uptake. You'll hear more about policing and relations with law enforcement from Chief Butler, but I wanted to talk for a few minutes about restorative justice in schools. I personally got involved because I wanted to stop the school to prison pipeline. A student who is more suspended is likely to end up in the criminal justice system. Our restorative justice provides an alternative to suspension, but much more than that. It's about shifting the culture of school and establishing a whole school restorative approach to education and discipline. It's not about substituting restorative justice for traditional discipline. It's about creating community with everyone in the school community: students, teachers, staff, parents, school safety officers, janitors, cafeteria workers, everyone. It's about building positive relationships and promoting greater ownership of the school. It's often approached in tiers, and it's important to remember it takes years to shift culture. The first tier is about community building in the school. It includes social and emotional skill building for the students and everyone else. And it includes conflict resolution skills. Shared values are discussed, and peers develop deeper bonds. Schools need to develop a structure for their restorative program, and each school is unique, and so the structure has to be aligned with that school's needs. It's important to have a team in the school and leadership has to have bought in, or it won't really take root. If your leaders don't shift the culture, the culture in the school won't shift. The second tier is integrating restorative practices into the whole school. It includes training and circles with staff and all of the school community. Begin to integrate restorative problem solving and discipline. And disciplinary measures begin to shift from punitive to restorative approaches, including restorative chats, staff and student mediation, peer mediation, harm or conflict circles, addressing the school discipline code to emphasize restorative discipline. It can involve students, circle keepers, and families. The third tier is about reaching the more difficult students and using restorative approaches to more conflicts, including re-entry when students are suspended or out of school. It's about building resiliency and allowing challenged students to feel respected and included in the process in which they are engaged in, and compelled to own the consequences of their behavior in a dignified manner. It includes healing circles, parent circles. Parents can become circle keepers. We encourage students to attend and students and staff and families to attend conferences and participate, sharing their experiences. It can be about becoming a model school. Each school will develop its own plan and priorities and might use different languages. For example, a harm circle or a conflict circle is very similar. Schools may not have all the elements of restorative practices, but choose directions that meet their school needs. So that's a brief overview of school restorative justice in schools and an understanding of restorative justice that's common, not just mine, but more broadly than that. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our other speakers.
Thank you so much, Jill. Chief Butler.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. And thank you for your introductory comments, Jill. I think you you covered a significant amount in a very short period of time. I have 8 to 10 minutes here, folks. And this is an 8 to 10 week kind of deal in terms of what's happening in restorative justice. Let me just give you a little idea about Longmont. We're 100,000 people. We're right on the edge of the Rocky Mountains. We're about 30 miles north of Denver. We have a really diverse community, about 35% Latino. And we've had our share of, previous to my being involved in public safety in Longmont, we did have our Ferguson and Minneapolis back in the 1980s, when a white police officer shot 2 Latino young boys. This town almost burned down as a result of that. But there's always been this, since before, but definitely since, there's been this desire to heal what we have done in this community over the decades and centuries since Longmont's been a community. Let me just real quickly give you, there's a lot of historical context that I'm not going to be talking about that would give people an understanding and awareness as to why our criminal justice system is operating the way it operates, and why police are operating within the system the way they operate, and what that looks like and how they do things. I think that historical context is important, but I'm not going to talk about that a lot. I'm just not even going to really touch on it all that much, other than to say that what we got used to in this country, not just the criminal justice system or police, but in this country, is criminalizing our woundedness. You can look at our woundedness in terms of our social and health issues, addiction, mental health issues, homelessness, domestic violence, abuse of lots of different kinds. But what we did was we tried to criminalize that by passing laws, stiffening penalties, as if passing laws and stiffening penalties would serve as an insurance policy that would protect us from the human condition. Well, I can assure you, I've been around the system long enough to know, and I've been all over the country, and I speak all over the country, that I have yet to see one of those kinds of laws fix a social issue, nor have I seen the stiffening of penalties fix a particular social issue. So our way of doing business for decades has been passing laws, stiffening penalties, criminalizing our woundedness. That the slogans of "get tough on crime" and "3 strikes and you're out" are things that we basically lived with for decades. And police were utilized as a law enforcement arm of government to go out and make sure that people who violated these laws were brought to justice. Let me also say a little something here about the nature of justice that's important. It's important, the nature of justice in terms of how we define it becomes critical. Right now, when someone gets hurt, when someone's family member is a victim of some kind of heinous crime, oftentimes you'll see a media mic put in front of their person, and what is it you want? And that person will say, "I want justice." And oftentimes that has become how we define justice. We want a pound of flesh. We want an eye for an eye. We want to be retributive. We want punitive. And frankly, one of the things I'm kind of struck by is the paradox and irony of, as we try to move forward in the whole realm of transforming our criminal justice system and police, that states around the country are utilizing the same kind of approach to try to fix police departments, as if we can look at the deficiencies of people, we can look at deficiencies of professions like policing or the criminal justice system, through that prism, we're going to find a way to fix those problems. This is a whole other kind of thing to talk about, but that's not going to work. We're not going to fix people like we're trying to criminalize our woundedness by looking at people as a problem to be solved, and passing laws as if we're going to basically fix them by punishing. And we're not going to do that, by the way, with our police, our criminal justice system. There are ways of transforming police and transforming our criminal justice system without seeing our police as a problem to be solved, without seeing our criminal justice system as a problem to be solved. I'm not saying that there aren't issues, believe me, but that's not how we did business here. That wasn't the approach we took in Longmont, as we shifted our culture from one of very strict command and control, not being a partner with the community, not really concerned about the relationships we had with the community, as a faceless entity behind this fortress that we all worked in. We didn't shift it that way. We shifted, and I'm not going to dwell a lot on that. We shifted it in an entirely different way. And that is where I think mayors, city councils, legislators from state general assemblies are all on bended knee in terms of trying to figure out how we can transform, how we can reimagine, how we can reset, recalibrate, rethink how we do this in our country, how we move forward. Because the future is not going to be improved by mandating or legislating or stiffening penalties. It won't be forced. It's just not going to happen. You can't bring about transformation by forcing or purchasing or somehow selling something. It's just not going to work. Now, that gives you a little context that I can spend literally days talking about and our own experiences around what that looked like. And so how do you transform the idea of what justice can look like from one of what Jill talked about, from one of being punitive and retributive, seeing people as a problem to be solved, seeing that we're going to try to legislate our future, we're going to try to enforce our way into some less woundedness. How do we move from there to a kind of a form of justice where, as Jill said, their accountability is chosen. Victims of harm become the centerpiece. Their voice begins to really count. Their thoughts matter. Their humanness is valued. And where the community has significant impact on and influence on the outcomes. That became for us in Longmont kind of the how do we move forward foundation. We asked 3 questions for the most part. What do we need to do to keep our community safe? How do we minimize recidivism? And how do we help victims become whole and heal? I can assure everybody that if those were the 3 questions that we asked, it would shift the nature of conversations. It would shift how we do business. It would shift how we could move into the future that's different and distinct from the past, a future that has this aliveness and being that we all want to live into in this way, versus saying, okay, we're going to punish, we're going to be punitive, and we're going to criminalize our woundedness. That's been our style. And right now, what I'm seeing from all over the country is, in terms of kind of recalibrating, transforming, re-envisioning what police are doing, it's basically just a repackaging of an old model. We're going to pass an ordinance. We're going to pass a state law. We're going to change a policy. We're going to add body cameras. I can assure you that those things will not, and I want to emphasize, will not transform anything. But that's the approach we've been taking. So when you go back into, now we're talking about restorative justice. I don't use the phrase restorative justice as much as I used, as was pointed out in my introduction, restorative principles and practices, and in which some of the principles have been talked about. Over the years in Longmont, we basically shifted from a very punitive model to a very restorative model. Now, sometimes restorative justice can be packaged in a program. Oftentimes it's packaged in a program. We have this restorative justice program, and I can assure everybody that that's going to fall way short of where we all want to end up being. And until restorative principles and practices become a philosophy of how we are with each other. And so, and what's also important here, folks, it's not just shifting the system, the folks within the system, their thinking and their practices. It's also being very clear that this community, our communities have to embrace a more enlightened way of seeing the nature of justice. The three things I talked about: how do we keep the community safe? How do we get people to choose accountability? How do we get victims to heal? And how do we get the community, maybe a fourth, how do we get the community to have more influence? There are ways of coalescing righteousness, goodness, and justice in a way that serves the good of the whole, everybody. Now, practice-wise, we did a lot of that, which maybe this is what you want to hear more about in Longmont, but we referred tens of thousands of cases over the years have been dealt with restoratively. Through our restorative justice service, we've referred 7,000 plus people to restorative justice. Now, Longmont's 100,000 people. But when you start doing the economy of scale, let's say Westchester's 1 million, 10 times as big. If you began to see those numbers proportionally in Westchester, you would begin to see a significant shift in how people define justice. Right now, our community is 20,000 plus people have been exposed to restorative justice in one form or fashion in our community over the years. And that number just grows exponentially as our community begins to realize that there is another way of defining justice than this pound of flesh, an eye for an eye like mindset, primitive as that might be. So 7,000 people have been referred to restorative justice. We deal with the folks struggling with mental health, folks struggling with addiction, folks struggling with homelessness, and I've got to believe that Westchester has its fair share of all those things going on. And by the way, those three issues, addiction, mental health, and homelessness, take up a tremendous amount of resources within any one community, especially public safety and criminal justice resources. But I also want to say that we deal with a lot of things restoratively. And so the question becomes somewhat how, but the question, if people begin to realize that there's something much more effective and much more powerful, the how becomes, I'm not saying it's less significant, but it becomes something that if people are thinking and feeling and wanting to do business that way, the how questions become much easier to answer, because there can be many different ways of proceeding with the how part. So in essence, that's what I want to make sure that's clear for everybody that's on this Zoom. It's shifting the philosophy, the thinking, the ideas of how you can move forward, how you can create a future that's different than the one we have now. We started a quarter of a century ago with restorative practices and principles in this community. And it took, I want to say, there's not over the years, there hasn't been a lot easy about that. But we did do some things in the beginning that helped us significantly. Number one, we kept track. We did a statistical analysis as we kept data on everything that we did restoratively. What I find interesting is that when you want to introduce something that's new to the mainstream doesn't get measured anywhere near as much as what you want to introduce as something new has to become measured in order to compete with the mainstream. I would bet Westchester has the kind of data that we found in our community in terms of what's happening with mainstream criminal justice. A number of years ago, we did a study where we looked at hundreds of people that we arrested in 1 year for felony property crimes, burglary, car break-ins, and vandalism. And when we looked at the criminal history of each of those several hundred people that we arrested that particular year, this is years ago, we found that on average, each of those people had been arrested 9 times. And on average, each of those people had been charged 16 times. And so, but here they are, 10th time, still committing felonies. And so I offered that as data, not only to our community, but to our police staff, and saying, who among you live your lives that way? Who among you takes your broken car to a mechanic and say, okay, you didn't get it right the previous 9 times, but this 10th time, we're going to make it work. We don't live our lives that way. But yet that's how the criminal justice system kind of operates. Not kind of, it operates that way. But that number and that kind of data and that kind of reality isn't something that gets questioned. And so we continue on down the path of doing criminal justice in the primitive form that we do it. And so we did a lot of data analysis on the front end. We also did a lot of data analysis with restorative practices and principles. You know, our recidivism rate, over 7,000 plus people that we referred, is less than 5%. The criminal justice system, it's enormous, up to 60, 70%. What do you want to work with? You want to work with something that's effective, or you want to work with something that is effective versus not being effective? So we did a lot of data analysis because that's what people want to understand and know. So that track record was developed over the years. It didn't take long for us to develop that track record. It didn't take long for our police officers to realize that they wanted something that was effective as well. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time right now in terms of how we deal with folks struggling with mental health and addiction, but I want to make it real clear by giving you there's many case examples, but by talking about one person that we actually saw, not just us, but other police departments and sheriff's departments saw over 1,000 times, and often would see this person in the winter, cold in Colorado, frozen to the ground in their own urine, and often 0.3 to 0.35 in their BAL, extreme alcoholic, had mental health issues. I want to make a long story real short here, but by using restorative practices, we no longer see that person. That person now has a job. That person now has a place to live. That person is now reconnected back to their family. Dozens and dozens of examples like that our officers began to see. Now, I had to deal with, in the beginning, sabotage, undermining. I had dealt with editorials from the community. They're saying that Butler is being really goofy with trying to, that was a nice way of saying what they were saying, basically asking for my job. And at one point, our union held confidence votes on me because of the shifts we were trying to make. So we had to go through a lot of gnashing of teeth and crawling over glass to get to a point where people stopped undermining and sabotaging and resisting. And that can come in all kinds of forms, some overt and some very subtle, in terms of the resistance to, we got to continue on down this path of this very ineffective way of doing business, of arresting people and trying to criminalize our woundedness, and 3 strikes and you're out and getting tough on crime. But these things have proven incredibly effective. Our community is now very much engaged with restorative practices. And by the way, we kept our restorative services out from underneath the umbrella of government. We purposely kept it within the community because we wanted this to be a community-based operation. We didn't want it to be something that was kind of controlled by government, if you will, and kind of whatever the budget was within government, it was kind of at the whims of whatever was going to happen from a budget perspective. And we know that that works. And I know of many examples from around the country where the budget itself became the demise of restorative practices and principles in a community. So we really worked to develop what I'll refer to as social capital around restorative practices and justice. And by the way, that's a whole new week of discussion around the development, the surfacing and activating and coordinating of social capital in any one community to help with all of this. So I know I'm over my 8 to 10 minutes. I could go 8 to 10 weeks and not get close to where I have to be with this, so I'll let it at that. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Chief Butler, that was really helpful for all of us to hear how you went through this 25-year process of implementing restorative justice in Longmont. Before we open up for discussion, we do have Jeannie from the Brooklyn's District Attorney's Office.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm grateful to be here today. My name is Jeannie Lopez, and I'm the Bureau Chief of the Red Hook Community Justice Center for the Brooklyn DA's office. I've been with the Red Hook Community Justice Center since 2017, but with the DA's office in total, I'm dating myself now, but for over 21 years. And, you know, I've done it all throughout the DA's office. I came up as a line assistant and worked my way up the ranks, homicide, you know, every type of supervisor you could imagine. And then I ended up in Red Hook. And, you know, I came up, and I say I was raised in the DA's office, you know, but when I was coming up in the DA's office, I came up under, you know, this retribution was the goal. And as Jill was stating earlier, and Michael, you know, your crime, what punishment could fit the crime? That was the way all our thought processes were. I don't want to say for every prosecutor, but you know, for the majority of us, that's the way we were taught to think. And what I started seeing coming up the ropes was that recidivism was rampant. I would see the same person, the same name, just keep coming through. It was like the wheel, the hamster on the wheel, just rolling and rolling, you know, week by week, day by day, and they would just rack up cases. And what we used to offer, we didn't really have diversion at that time. What we would offer was jail, and we would just up the jail time. So if it was misdemeanor, you know, the max on a misdemeanor is 1 year in jail, we would just keep going up. So 15 days the first time, 25 days the second time, 30 days, 45 days, and on to up to, you know, 365 days. And I realized it wasn't deterring the people who were coming into the system. And I also was seeing that most people coming through the system were of Black and brown skin. And when I first got here, everything to me was black and white. You commit the crime, you do the time. You know, I simplified it. And I started to realize as the years went by that it just wasn't that simple. And when I was chosen by the district attorney to go to Red Hook, at first, you know, I heard of the Red Hook Community Justice Center. Truth be told, I had never walked in through those doors until I was promoted to the bureau chief of that courthouse. Sad to say, but that courthouse and working there and the experiences that I've gained from working there have really changed my life. I'm talking about as a human being, not a prosecutor. It's just made me, I believe, a more well-rounded human being. And I could have never gained that without going there. So for that, I'm grateful to the district attorney. But when I got there, you know, we do use restorative justice and also something called procedural justice, which is, you know, it works hand in hand with restorative justice, but basically we treat anyone who walks in through those doors that is entering the criminal justice system, we treat them with respect, meaning we call them by their last name or their first name if they like, you know, if they complete a program or or complete diversion, before they even arraigned, we clap for them. We speak to them. We treat them as human beings, not just as a docket number. So that in itself was very, very foreign to what I was used to. And I still don't see that as often as I should see it, unfortunately, in other courthouses. But we do practice that on a daily basis at the Red Hook Community Justice Center. But with restorative justice, I'm just going to piggyback off of Michael and Jill. Prosecutors, I'm going to say this, we can be the forefront for restorative justice. We should be, and we can be, in implementing a gamut of different restorative justice programs, because I will tell you, when restorative justice is successful, it reduces recidivism. Anyone who is working within the restorative justice parameters, for the most part, are happy at the outcomes, whether it's someone who has been wounded or the person who's responsible for the harm caused. Usually both sides are satisfied with the outcome. And also it's cost effective. If you do the cost of keeping someone incarcerated at Rikers Island, right? About 2 years ago, I heard it was at like close to $200,000 for the year. You don't have that cost with restorative justice. We're just not spending that type of money. And so if government is involved and they hear like, almost $200,000 to house someone and feed someone at Rikers Island versus, close to nothing. I mean, let's do the math. But I know restorative justice is a very foreign concept for many people. And I have to tell you, truth be told, when I first got to Red Hook, I was not a believer. There's a whole gamut of programs, and I could be here more than Michael could, probably 3 hours or 5 hours talking about all the different programs. But I'm going to hone in on one, which is the peacemaking program that we have available at our community court. So that program, listen, I think that's one of the best programs we have out of the myriads that we have there. But this one in particular deals right on point with restorative justice. So basically, we send low-level type of crime cases to that program, usually where there's someone that's been harmed and someone who has caused the harm, right? Those are the parties involved. And before we even start any type of peacemaking process, the person who comes into the system has to admit culpability. They have to at least admit that they did something wrong, acknowledge that. If they're not willing to acknowledge that they've caused some type of harm, then we won't even send it to that program. But once we get to that point and they do admit some type of culpability, then we'll reach out. If there's a victim involved, we'll reach out to the victim and we'll discuss the program to them. And basically the program is, it's like, really, it's based off the Navajo Indians, and it's circle. And I mean, I've sat in on them, so I can tell you that literally a pipe is being passed around and you can't speak unless you have the pipe in your hand. But before we even get to circle, we have a clinic at the Justice Center with social workers, obviously work there. And the social workers will meet with both the person who has caused the harm and the person who has experienced the harm separately. And we try to find out what their needs are. Basically, if the person who caused the harm is unemployed or, sometimes doesn't even have a GED, we try to see what got them here in the first place, not just the particular crime, that they committed, but what got them here. And basically the social workers will give us an extensive preview of, what their life has been like. And once we have that, we also speak to the person who was harmed, and the social workers will try to see, what their needs are. So to try to meet their needs separately. And then once both parties feel safe, we describe the peacemaking process to them, and that if it's a safe circle, that no one is going to be physically assaulted, or if tensions do get high, people are able to express themselves. And once both sides are comfortable enough to come into circle, then it happens. This can take, I mean, we would like for it to take sometimes a week or 2 weeks, but sometimes it takes months. In the meantime, for prosecutors, yes, 30-30 time is waived. So we're not just letting the case, go away up until the end, but the parties come together and we focus on what got them there, why it happened, what escalated it, and what can we do to make the person who was harmed whole. And the person who commits the wrong, we try to hold them accountable. And when I say that, I'll say if it's an assault case, if there's medical bills involved, we'll have that person, if they can, pay their medical bills, apologize. Sometimes the victim just really wants to be heard. They just want to be able to let the person who hurt them know how they hurt them and what harm was caused to them, and get an apology. And once they feel like they've been heard and the person who's caused the harm acknowledges that hurt, I've seen miracles happen there. I'm going to give you one case in particular, very quickly. It was an assault of a UPS worker. And this is before I was a believer. And then I was like, okay, I have to believe in this. There's some magic here. This case, the victim was a UPS worker and he was delivering, it was around not Christmas time, it was around Ramadan time. And he was delivering packages on a one-way street in Brooklyn. So if anybody's been to Brooklyn on a one-way street in Prospect Park Heights, very narrow streets, and the UPS truck was blocking the entire, street. No one could get by him, no cars. And there were three young individuals who were observing Ramadan and were about to break fast. Now, they were young. I want to say 2 were brothers and a cousin. No one was older than 19 in that vehicle, maybe between the ages of 18 and 20, maybe at max. They had some arrests, but very like ACD violations, no, no misdemeanors, no felonies on their record. And these 3 young men are trying to rush home to break fast, and the UPS truck is blocking their way and they cannot get by. And the UPS worker, he has a schedule, he has to meet. So he has a bunch of packages and he's delivering to different homes, and they're banging, they're like beeping the horn, they're trying to get through, and he's telling them to hold on. I'm not sure really what occurred out there. There's always 3 sides to the story, right? Her side, his side, and then somewhere in the middle is the truth. But tempers did flare on both sides. The UPS worker was not fast enough for the young men, and the 3 young men ended up assaulting the UPS worker with, I believe, their hands and feet. But he was severely injured. He was hospitalized for a few days. Thankfully, he's alive. He received some stitches, and a broken rib, but there were no weapons involved. And when it came in through as a misdemeanor, but when I saw the injuries, I went back to that retribution way of thinking, and I was like, I don't think this should be a misdemeanor. So I asked the victim to come in. I want to see if we had like gang assault, something. And we went through what happened out there. And as he was speaking to me, I asked him what he would like done with the case, or what did he think justice would be. And, nowhere in that conversation was he talking about jail. At the end, what I realized was he wanted to be heard. He wanted those men to know the pain they put him through, the anguish, and he wanted to know why this happened. Like, how could something escalate in a matter of seconds to him being beat almost to death, really? And once I saw that, I expressed my personal opinion to the victim in that case, and he agreed with me. And then I explained to him a little bit about the peacemaking process. I don't try to go into it, I leave that for the social workers to go through it thoroughly, because they're trained to do that. But I could definitely see that the victim was on board. He was willing to try that. And he asked me, he says, well, what will end up happening at the end of the case? And I said, whatever you agree to and whatever those young men agree to, that's what happens. And he was like, are you serious? And I said, yep, well, we can talk about that when we get there. And the process started. It was a long process. It took months. But at the end of that peacemaking process, what ended up happening was the young men, they usually write letters to the court and letters of apology to the victim, acknowledging their wrongs, saying what they plan to do if they haven't already started to do things to make it right as much as they can. And they did that. But in this case, something happened that I never saw happen before that. The victim also wrote a statement and read it in court. And basically, it brought tears to, I try not to cry, but it brought tears to my eyes because that I had never seen happen. And he basically thanked myself and everyone who suggested peacemaking to him. And he expressed how his voice was heard, how he felt that he took a part in what the justice or the outcome should be. And he never had experienced that. He was very grateful that we allowed him the opportunity to be heard and really go through the process of restoring him. And he took an active part in that. And so that's when I was like, wow, there's some truth to this. And anyway, at the end of the day, I never expected him to want the cases to be dismissed. I thought he would want an order of protection, but we always allow the parties to agree to whatever the outcome should be. And he said he wanted the case to be dismissed for all three individuals. And I was shocked. And that's what we did. And for the non-believers, I know it's very hard to even imagine something like that. But what we did in that case was, one, let the victim be heard and let his story be shared in his own way. And we respected him for that, I think. Two, those young men were able to be given a second chance while still being held accountable for their actions. So they ended up, all three of them got together and saved all their money and paid his medical bills. They apologized to him. They heard him out. It's my understanding that their father owns a restaurant, two of the brothers, and the victim goes in there to this day and eats at the restaurant. He got to understand what Ramadan was about. And these the young men also realized that, they made the split second decision to assault this human being with no regard for his life, but they also started to realize what the consequences of their actions were. Instead of just putting them in jail, giving them no resources to better their lives or become, more productive members of society, because that's really what happens to young people or anyone who's incarcerated for extensive periods of time. They're not given the proper resources to come out into society and not commit crime. Where restorative justice, we focus on ensuring as best as we can that everyone is provided with resources so that we do reduce recidivism, and the criminal justice system is more cost effective. But that's my spiel. I do believe wholeheartedly in restorative justice. And I think that prosecutors should be first and foremost at the forefront of implementing restorative justice into the criminal justice system.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. That was a very touching story. And I can tell that you have so much for us to learn from in Westchester County. So we really hope that you'll continue to be involved in our journey as we try and shift Westchester County to a more restorative model approach. I'd like to highlight all three of our panelists. If you want to ask or discuss amongst yourself for just a few minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of questions for from the audience. And there are people who are on lunch hour and they're logging off. I'm wondering if you want to put a question in the chat and the panelists don't have time in this session, you are welcome to do that. And we can check with the panelists. They may very well be willing to answer your questions after this session is over. And by the way, this is going to be a series. It's not the only presentation we'll be doing on restorative justice. Jill Sternberg and the Westchester Restorative Justice and the Anti-Racist Alliance will all be working on a series of presentations on restorative justice to generate interest in the subject. So if Chief Butler and Jill and Jeannie, if you have any questions or comments before we shift to questions.
I have a question for Ms. Lopez. And isn't your DA Eric Gonzalez? Is your DA Eric
Oh,
Gonzalez?
I thought you had a question. Yes, he is. Eric Gonzalez.
And I've read his white paper, or whatever it was written a few years ago in terms of where he wanted to move forward in terms of making arrest last resorts, et cetera, et cetera. How's that? I know that police departments are probably struggling with that, but what's going on with that, real quickly?
Yeah, so he wrote Justice 2020.
Right.
Basically, there were 17 initiatives that he wanted implemented by the end of 2020. So most of those 17 initiatives are up and running. We're working on the very few that are not, or we're in the process of that. I'm on that team, actually. So yes, we do have diversionary programs that even before, unfortunately, not before an arrest is made, because the police department has, I don't want to speak for the Commissioner Shea, but they're not, how can I put this? They make the arrest. They're not really open to working with us, not yet, on not arresting people for low-level crimes such as drug possession, marijuana possession. They still arrest people for violation of marijuana possession, where District Attorney Gonzalez has decided not to prosecute straight marijuana possession cases. Also, 22003 cases, unfortunately, an arrest is made, and when they're brought to the precinct, we do get notified of the arrest, and we are sending out peers to they're trained social workers, peers to the precinct to get as much contact information from the person arrested for drug possession, and engaging them in services right at that stage, right at the police precinct. And if they do successfully engage in just engaging in the services, not like completely completing it, doesn't have to be that, but just the fact that they decide to engage in any type of services offered at the precinct, we do not prosecute the case. We don't put the arrest through. Basically we decline to prosecute.
Great, thank you. So I'm just looking at the chat. There are lots of wonderful, feedback from all of you. A question for you, Chief Butler, about could police departments use restorative justice principles, not just for officers who've engaged in harm with community members, but also perhaps shifting your disciplinary standards within the department? Could you, by the way, did your local police department shift to restorative justice models or restorative practices for disciplining your own officers?
Yes, we've used restorative practices considerably with great effectiveness, not just between police officers and community members, but within internal things that happen within police. And police are saying, if you want us to use these principles and practices in the community, it would benefit us as well. And so it kind of shifts things from well, you're going to be punished and you're going to be given days off and whatever that's going to look like, to choosing accountability and allowing the victim's voice, if there's a victim, to be heard, and their voice heard, their thoughts, they know their thoughts matter. So yes, another long story in terms of what we did with that, but it's quite, and by the way, we also did that for Jill's sake. The school district asked us to come in and realign their entire punitive disciplinary system to make it much more restorative. And the number of suspensions, the number of expulsions are a fraction of what they once were, and they're seeing a better effect in terms of using restorative principles and practices.
Wonderful. One thing I was struck with Jeannie's example in Brooklyn was that I feel like a lot of people, unfortunately, in American mainstream, people feel there are big bucks to be made with lawsuits and such. If they've been hurt, they want to sue people, and we're very litigious as a society. but actually it may very well not bring healing in the way restorative justice can bring healing. So I was really struck by the generosity of this UPS driver who wasn't looking to make money off these 3 young men, but he wanted to reach a meaningful resolution to what had happened to him. And that's part of the appeal for me, is that it's a very deep kind of almost spiritual approach to dealing with harm. You're not looking to make thousands or lots of money off of people, but you have a desire to recognize the humanity and restore your own humanity and other people's humanity, and feel like we live in a caring community, that we're trying to meet people's needs. So I just love that. Jill, do you have,
well said. Well said. I appreciate what you just said. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Nada, I think I want to follow that up by saying that about a year ago, we started a restorative justice network in Westchester, and we are working with the district attorney's office to try to make some shift there. There's a lot going on in the county, but it's very disparate. It's little pockets here and there. And our goal is to really have an initiative that looks like the diverse population of Westchester and serves the communities where restorative justice is most needed. And really, I mean, a personal goal is to have somebody in every community, in each one of our communities, who is an advocate and promoting and working on restorative justice. And we're here to support you to become that person. We have a training coming up at the end of the month. I put a bit of information about it in the chat. And we just recently got a grant to, together with the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform, have community building circles to follow up the police reform and reinvention process that we just went through. And I think really to Chief Butler's comments, our goal is to really have that conversation and begin to shift the relationships between our communities and our police, so that we can create something that's not punitive on either side, but that can really work to make this cultural shift in our county. So there's a lot going on. Cluster, our county mediation center, does work in the courts, particularly in family court. Family Services of Westchester has programs that work with young men coming out of prison, fathers, community members, to address challenges that they're having. And there are some programs in our jails and prisons and schools. So there is work going on, and we really we need more help. The only limit to creating a restorative Westchester is people power. So please join us. I put my contact information in the chat.
wonderful.